Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Mr. Bynum will defend his academic thesis, Out of the Shadows, a qualitative exploration of shame in learners across the continuum of medical education. I wish you lots of success, and of course, your parnymph as well. And I also welcome your supervisors, Professor Teunissen, and online, Professor Farpio, and of course, the opponents online and here on site, whom you will meet later on. And also welcome the audience here present on site and those online. And before we start the opposition, I give you the floor to present a presentation about the things you have studied and presented in your thesis.
Thank you, dear Prorector, members of the committee, supervisors, hi Lara, family and friends at home, and to my wife, especially, who is my remote paranymph today from home, unable to make the trip. This is a real privilege to be here and to get to share this work with you and to have received so much support over the years of working on this project. This research program actually started about 10 years ago when I was a second-year family medicine resident, and I made my first major medical error. And it was a severe maternal injury that I caused during a vaginal birth that I was delivering. And what can best be described is an emotional inferno ensued after this really difficult event. It started as fear and anxiety and a fight or flight response that relatively quickly cascaded into a very harsh self-indictment and self-evaluation that was characterized by feelings of inadequacy, incompetence, not being good enough, being untrustworthy, being someone that hurts people, and ultimately feeling like I didn't belong in the profession, which is an incredibly jarring and unexpected experience for me. In the days, weeks that followed, I recovered from the shame and came to understand this construct through actually Brené Brown's TED Talk, her transformative TED Talk, that gave me a name and some structure to understanding what I had been through. And as a part of this, I came to what I'll provide as a quite simple definition of shame, which is an emotional state in which we engage in a self-evaluation, often in response to a triggering event, and deem ourselves to be globally flawed, deficient, or unworthy in some way. And as I continued my recovery, I began to notice that the environments around me and the people and the interactions around me seemed to confer a great deal of shame, whether it be a teaching exchange, patient care, the response to a medical error, or a learning task, that I started to notice this emotion around me, having now been through it myself. And yet no one was talking about it. No one was outwardly acknowledging it, and there was no space to engage with it. My curiosity led me further, feeling like I had maybe stumbled into something important, into the literature. And I surveyed two bodies of literature. First, the psychology literature, which had a lot to say about shame, its definition, how it relates to other related emotions, and the many constructs with which it's associated that matter deeply to us in medical education: depression and anxiety and PTSD, impaired empathy, and even suicidality. The medical education literature presented me with information about how emotions can influence medical training. And while it was a nascent body of work at the time, it was encouraging to see that there was attention paid to emotional experiences. And then this was the beginning of what would be an explosion of literature around the many ways in which the well-being of medical trainees can be impaired. But despite seeing a lot of signal for shame in this literature, in our own, and a lot of crosstalk between the two literatures, there was very little, nearly nothing written or researched about it. And so what I found in the environment around me was the same as what I found in the literature in front of me. And it was the contemporaneous presence and absence of shame. And so somewhat serendipitously and through a painful personal experience, I'd stumbled into what I still believe is a major gap in our understanding of essentially what it means to become a medical professional and how we experience emotion as we go through that process, that being the role of shame in medical education. And so to bring this construct and this phenomenon out of the shadows and into the light in medical education, I asked a fundamental question, not presupposing that medical trainees would experience shame similar to what had been described in psychology. We asked a fundamental question of how this emotion is experienced by medical learners as they navigate the continuum of medical education. And we conducted this research in 3 populations, starting first with medical residents and then medical students, and finishing with pre-medical students seeking admission to the profession. To answer our research question, we used hermeneutic phenomenology, which is a powerful qualitative methodology from the interpretivist paradigm that seeks to convey the nature and the meaning of a phenomenon in the context of lived experience. It uses, or it asks the researcher to engage constantly with the parts of that phenomenon, or the components that give it shape, and the whole of that phenomenon, or what has been described as the often ineffable essences of that phenomenon that help to convey its deeper meaning in the context of lived experience. So borrowing from this tradition of hermeneutics, I'm going to actually use the structure of the parts and the whole to take you through an overview of our findings. The first being the components of shame. We found in the first study and then again in the subsequent 3 that shame is an individually experienced emotion that occurs as that individual engages with the environment around them. So while shame is uniquely individual in that it arises from a series of appraisals and attributions that form a self-evaluation, that occurs as the person interacts with and is influenced by the environment around them. So environment and context really matter when it comes to shame. We then sought to identify the situations or circumstances or events that could precipitate a shame reaction or could trigger a shame reaction. And we found those events related to patient care, such as making a medical error that harmed a patient, related to learning, such as struggling in front of a group, related to assessment, such as struggling on a board exam or a self-test, related to who I am as a person, such as being underrepresented in medicine, related to personal goals, such as failing to match into a fellowship. We then attempted to understand why a certain trigger led to a shame reaction in any given person, and this directed us to what we called shame promoters. These are personal characteristics, environmental factors, interpersonal dynamics that either amplified shame once it had been triggered, either made it more intense or prolonged it, or that predisposed its occurrence and increased the likelihood that shame would occur in the presence of a given trigger. And shame promoters included things like being a perfectionist, a tendency to compare to others, possessing a fixed mindset, being an underrepresented minority among dominant norms, or learning in a psychologically unsafe environment. Having defined or characterized some of the way that shame can originate, we then looked at how it feels once it's in place, so the nature of the shame reaction itself. And we started with what we called the phenomenological elements of a shame reaction, which are presented here in this table. These were sort of the lowest elemental components of a shame reaction, the presentation of which in this table gives you a sense of how incredibly complex this emotional state can be, both for learning, well-being, and just functioning in day-to-day life. As we looked at the relationships across these various phenomenological elements, we were directed to specific cognitive and emotional processes that help give further shape to the shame state and the shame reaction, some of which are presented here, such as spiraling shame, or what we call the skewed frame of reference, so the difficulty accurately self-assessing relative to objective reality, emotional self-assessment that would override rational self-assessment. That these processes and their antecedents really began to help us understand what is happening in a shame reaction, how it feels, and how it makes people think. As we looked across both the elements and these specific processes and question the deeper meaning of our data, to attempt to describe the whole of this experience, it brought us to what we have identified as a fundamental essence of shame, and that being that it is a destabilizing emotional state. And this was described throughout the studies in ways such as feeling depersonalized and disoriented, having emotional vertigo, feeling like I'm unmoored, like I've lost my anchor and I'm floating out to sea, that the shame state itself could lead to a very destabilized existence, either acutely or chronically, depending on the nature of the situation. When we studied shame in our fourth study in pre-medical students, we had the opportunity to go deeper into the nature of the destabilization that we found in previous studies, which we again found in this population. And what we identified is that shame ultimately appears to destabilize our self-concept. So self-concept, being described in psychology most simply, is what we think about when we think about ourselves. It comprises our identities, who we are and who we're trying to be and how we know ourselves to be, as well as our self-esteem, or how we feel about the people we are, the people we're trying to become or know ourselves to be. So in other words, self-concept comprises the semantic and the visual and the affective representation. So the words we use to describe ourselves, the ways we see ourselves, the feelings we have about ourselves that help to characterize who we are, who we were, and who we can become. And we found that in a shame state, not always, but often, there was a challenge to self-concept. There was sometimes a change to self-concept, insofar as shame could skew our evaluation of who we are, implicate or draw upon elements of who we were, and impact our perception of who we can become. So as I had the Herculean task, really, of trying to take 4 years of work into 15 minutes, and then leave you with a few minutes of final thoughts, I really struggled to find what was the deepest or the deeper essences that we can draw from the entire program of research. And I'm going to present a couple as my discussion. The first being that shame is an emotion that matters in medical education. It is happening. It is having significant impact. Our environments are primed for it. And yet it exists in the shadows. It exists in the depths, yet is having a significant impact on us. And I worry that as we examine what it means to be well or unwell in medical training and in medicine, our attention, rightly, is directed towards those states of impairment that we can easily define, that we can easily measure quantitatively, and thus that we can more easily engage with. And as we direct the majority of our attention to these more well-defined constructs, we risk running into the icebergs of shame and other constructs that may be more stigmatized and difficult to measure. So the goal being, with this research and any research that follows or is done in collaboration, to really bring this emotion to the surface and those like it, and recognize, enhance our ability to recognize it, enhance our capacity for awareness of shame, to be able to facilitate proactive engagement with this emotion and the provision of support. And our research in the elements and constructs and essences that it provide a roadmap for how we might do this at the intrapersonal level, facilitating what has been defined as shame resilience, or the ability to proactively engage with shame in a way that enhances self-concept and orients us towards growth. It will direct us to develop greater degrees of shame competence interpersonally. So shame competence being defined by my colleague Luna Dolezal as the capacity to understand shame, the ability to recognize it in its many manifestations in human behavior, and the ability to, I would add, proactively support someone experiencing shame once we're aware of its presence. And then we may go broader than that to the environmental, institutional, and even ideological levels, taking shame competence as the foundation and infusing it throughout our environments and our institutions, such that we maintain constant awareness of the potential for this emotion and awareness of the ways in which it might manifest in our environments, and the ability not only to eliminate the unnecessary shame that has no place in medicine, but to help mitigate the effects of the shame that remains and that may be hard to avoid. The other thing that I was struck by with this research program and really reflecting on it as I wrote the dissertation was the unexpected evolution of this research program is one that focused on shame as a phenomenon, to one that ultimately leverages shame as a window. When we take an emotion and an experience as profound as this, that aligns so deeply with who we are as people and the worlds in which we live, we have the chance to put it out in front of us, to examine it in multiple angles and dimensions. And that tells us a lot about what it means to be a human in medicine. It tells us about our personal identities, who we are when we come into medicine, and how these identities are shaped during the process of learning. It tells us about the structures, the norms, and the values and ideologies that influence that identity development. And it tells us about the interaction and integration of those norms and values and ideologies with our personal identities in the marrying and creation of a professional identity. But critically, shame takes us beyond identity formation in medicine and tells us about the processes of self-esteem that help to govern those identities and the sources and the contingencies of those self-esteem that make us feel like worthy people as we adopt those identities. It tells us about how these many factors, all of which come back to who we are as humans, how we see and know and feel about ourselves, how they interact, and it tells us about some of the structures in which that interaction occurs, the institutional processes, the environmental factors, the interpersonal interactions, and the historical structures that shape the environments in which this interaction happens, that influence the nature of those interactions, either inhibiting or facilitating them. Having come to shame as a window, this and the I guess the deep thinking that this has incurred, plus some amazing mentorship, this has given us the opportunity to present this as a nascent theory of self-concept formation in learners that takes us steps beyond identity formation and includes the critical role of self-esteem. So to conclude, I will return to the metaphor of fire, which when first presented, may have been presented in a way that highlights the potentially destructive nature of shame, its potential to change the substrate of the person experiencing it and the self-concept that lies therein, to having us to consider shame through the lens of fire as a light, as having the ability to illuminate what ultimately it means to be a human in medicine. Last thing I'd like to say very briefly is a huge thank you to Pim, to Lara for their incredible mentorship and support, to my wife, Carson, I wish you were here so bad, and to my best friend, Chris, who actually was the person that took me through the shame reaction that led to this entire program of research and helped me ultimately recover. So with that, Director, I'll hand the word back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Candidate, for a very interesting presentation. We're now going to start the opposition, and the first opponent is also the chair of the assessment committee. That's Professor De Bruin, and she is a professor in self-regulation in higher education in the University of Maastricht. Professor De Bruin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I feel honored to be the first to congratulate you with your dissertation, which is an outstanding and thorough analysis of an unexplored yet very meaningful theme in health professions education, if not in any type of education. It is highly applaudable how you merge your personal and professional experience with the topic of your research and how you move from your own experiences and values to your research questions analysis and the theoretical advancements that you propose. Now, of course, your work also raises many questions, and I'd like to pose some of these to you today. My question revolves around the linkage from theory to practice. You advocate in your dissertation for a shift from an emphasis on professional identity formation to the more encompassing process of professional self-concept formation, and you do so convincingly, I think. In linking to the theme of your work, you also describe how shame can destabilize self-concept. And the complexity of this theoretical shift is clear, and your directions for future research are urgent. Now, when it comes to your thoughts and approaches to addressing how to practically deal with shame experiences and development of self-concept more generally, I still experience quite a gap. I would summarize these approaches as, on one hand, recognizing experiences of shame, addressing them, and creating awareness at the individual level, and on the other hand, changing the learning environment to be more inherently safe and inclusive for shame experiences. Now, given the complexity of these causal factors related to shame experiences, as you describe, the high value placed in performance, difficulty in transitioning to subjective standards, expectation of perfection, these approaches you describe to me appear to be both too simple and too difficult to achieve. Too simple because we know that creating awareness is just a mere first step to change in individuals, but certainly does not provide sustainable changes in beliefs, behavior, or let alone self-concept. And too difficult because pleading for a more safe learning environment that facilitates authentic self-expressions. Sounds to me like asking for a massive change in at least the assessment culture, starting probably at kindergarten. My first question would be, would you agree with me that awareness alone is not enough, and that massive educational cultural changes are probably too far stretched?
Yeah, esteemed professor, thank you so much for your comments and your question. I fully agree. I like the juxtaposition from simple to difficult, and I fully agree that stopping with acknowledgement and recognition would become far short of what needs to happen and what we're capable of changing in ourselves, in our interactions, and in our culture. I believe that simplicity is actually the first step, though. And the simplicity that I think we need to leverage is our own human experience. We are all inherently capable of experiencing shame, the vast majority of us who are psychologically functioning. And we do experience it as humans in the world. It's an evolved, normal emotion in many settings. Healthcare provides abundant opportunities for its occurrence. The simplest first step is to leverage our shared experience with this emotion, to normalize it, and to create community around it. We have the capacity to bond together through these shared experiences of shame. It seems counterintuitive, though, because it's such a stigmatized, hidden, and deeply experienced emotion. So while we might start simple, the solutions that we build at the same time on that foundation of shared connection and human experience are going to be difficult. And I think we have to figure out clever and creative ways to navigate that difficulty. I don't think it happens at any one level. We have to address it from multiple levels simultaneously, from the level of us as individuals and our own ability to engage with shame productively, to the ways in which we interact with one another and treat one another, which I believe stem back to the values that we hold in our environments. So re-examining some of those values in a way that aligns us to that respectful, civil, shame-resilient treatment is important. I think we need to look at our curricula, and we need to look at the way we structure our training environments. We certainly need to look at our institutional cultures and the way that they may facilitate or inhibit shame-resilient approaches to learning. And we need to look even higher than that to our ideologies. Those multiple levels are overwhelming all at once. I think we start simple, and then we begin building capacity at each one, and I think we can start a movement.
Is it really possible to start simple? Because the way you describe it now, in the sharing, there's also support already ongoing, whether it be it between peers or with teachers, etc. Are these two separable? It seems you describe them as separable. First, a simple context of sharing, and then there's room for support. But it also sounds like these are intricately related.
They are. They're intricately linked, and I wonder and I worry that we're not providing support to one another on the right level. The level at which shame exists is the self-conscious emotional level. It's deeper than the basic emotions. Shame and guilt and pride, they come from a place of self-evaluation, of self-assessment, and that differentiates them from emotions like fear and happiness and anxiety, which don't require that self-evaluation. We so often provide support on the level of the basic emotions, on the level of constructs such as burnout or anxiety, fear, sadness, often which has a visible display of emotion that calls the support in. Shame requires that we have ways to go deeper with the conversations we have, with the type of support that we provide. It requires us to get to that self-conscious level that we actively try and hide. It's very often hard to identify someone experiencing shame because they're not giving you an external manifestation of it unless you know to look for it. And that's really where shame competence comes into play. So awareness and support are absolutely tied together.
Okay. Do I have room for one short question? No, that's what I was figuring. Too bad. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor De Bruin, for your position. We now come to the following opponent, who is also a member of the assessment committee, and that's Dr. Delacroix. Her expertise is reflection and professional identity development in the University of Amsterdam.
Dear Mr. Candidates, like the people, like my predecessor, I would also like to offer my compliments for your very important work, both to you and to your supervisors. I think we have found the new Brené Brown of medical education. I want to start as a linguist. I always look at words and how we use them. I started with the word shame, and I realized after reading your work that I've used it wrong for years and years. I always thought you were ashamed of things you can't change. So your parents acting in an embarrassing way or a big nose, those are the things you're ashamed of. And guilty actually has to do with responsibility. When reading your work, I was conceptually and semantically confused. So I did what I do when I am confused in that way. And I looked at the dictionary, and that made me more confused because it said, shame is the feelings of sadness, embarrassment, and guilt. And guilt in your work is positioned completely differently. So my conclusion is the way I would use shame in everyday language, colloquially, is not the same as the definition of shame or approach to shame that you took. And I could see that in your qualitative work, you've played with telling your participants in your studies about the definition of shame or not mentioning shame. And can you elaborate on that?
Thank you so much for your question. I would, I'm not one to critique the dictionary, but I will say that using well-established theory from psychology, which is supported by an abundance of empirical evidence, we do have clear definitions among these various emotions. And the author of that dictionary may not have referenced that same literature as me. So the point I would certainly make is that when we talk about shame and guilt and embarrassment and pride, we need to be sure that we are defining those terms as we talk about them. Whether there's variability in how they're defined is not something we can control, but being precise as we talk about them is very important. Your question about providing the definition of shame versus using the term itself. So in the first study of shame in residence, we did not provide shame as the term for the emotion we were studying as we publicized it or as we gave them a prompt. We said instead, tell us about a time you felt flawed, deficient, or unworthy. The reason that we did that is that we did not want to trigger their underlying own definition of shame, which may have been very different than ours. We wanted to create that level playing field and be precise. And as we went through the first half of the interview, my knowledge of the theory that we were using helped me ensure that we were indeed talking about shame as it aligned or didn't align with that theory. About halfway through, we then told them we are talking about shame here, and we provided the definition because we didn't want to be disingenuous about our motives. In the studies that followed, both of those populations were those that had heard about shame. I knew they had heard about shame in our community, in our educational system, and so we felt the need to not be opaque about what we were studying, and we were able to provide that term ahead of time for them. But of course, we defined it again multiple times throughout the data collection process.
Yes, yeah, I did read that, and I could see your approach changed over time. I have a second very different question, and that's on page 163. You write some quotes about insights you gained during doing this research work, and one of them is that you said, I became aware of the immense emotional privilege of being a white man in medicine, because whatever rough stuff happened, you still felt like you belonged because the world is designed for people like you. And I was wondering, I have two questions about that. One of them is, are there people that consider themselves or are frequently portrayed or perceived as being the other in any way were in your samples of your studies? And the second question is, if you would continue research in this field and looking at this theme of diversity or inclusion and shame, what kind of study would you design?
Thank you, esteemed professor, for that question. This did show up often in our data set, that it ultimately fit under the component of shame promoter. Not always. And I'll give you an example in a minute of a different way it manifested. But often we would be exploring someone's experience of shame, And they would tell us that being outside of a dominant norm in some way contributed to their feelings of being inadequate or not good enough. For example, being an underrepresented minority demographically, being Black or African American, Latinx, being a member of a minority gender identity or sexual orientation, being from a part of the country that was underrepresented in our sample, or from a type of institution prior to coming to medical school that was a little more rare. What that experience could do was it could prey upon the initial shame trigger and amplify the shame that was felt, because it almost served as a voice in the back of their head that said, are you struggling because you're different? Was your admission to this medical school the product of a process that advantaged you when it should not have? And so it could turn normal learning struggle into a major shame experience to the degree that they recognize themselves as outside of the dominant norm. That wasn't always the case. It actually, being underrepresented in medicine could trigger shame. And we had a couple of instances where it was the trigger, when they said, I walked through the front door on the first day and I saw myself as different and I felt inadequate without any trigger to speak of. And then any subsequent struggle just amplified that feeling of not belonging. This is absolutely a topic that needs further exploration. And I think from the lens of shame, there's crossover to imposter syndrome. There's amazing work being done right now around identity safety, around the experience of professional identity formation in Black and African American students from Tasha Wyatt's group that is beginning to really build a body of work around this. What we hope to do is also help keep the lens on shame and understand how a learner's self-esteem and self-concept may be influenced by being underrepresented as well.
Thank you. No. Thank you, Dr. Delacroix, for your opposition. Time flies sometimes. We come to the following opponent. That's Professor Smink, and his chair is Quality Improvement of Residency Training in the University of Maastricht.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, first of all, I'd also like to compliment you and your supervisory team with your beautiful piece of work. In your thesis, you explored as one of the first researchers shame in the learning continuum. And as I discovered when preparing my opposition, it even seems to be a relatively under-researched topic in the field of psychology as well. And all this began with a personal experience you had in the beginning of your career, which again underlines a well-known quote made by a famous Dutch soccer player. Free translated, every disadvantage your experience will also have an advantage, your thesis. So it goes without saying that as a supervisor of residents in pulmonology and dean in my hospital, have read your thesis with great interest, and I feel very lucky that I'm now able to discuss some questions that came to my mind after reading your thesis. First, I tried to reflect on my own career, which started as a resident in 1983 and a consultant pulmonologist in 1989. And I tried really hard to remember whether or not I had experienced episodes of shame, but to be honest, I couldn't find any. Whereas after reading your thesis, you might expect I must have had some. So what's wrong with my interpersonal shame competency? And can you help me with that?
Thank you, highly esteemed professor, for your question. I am also not a psychologist, nor a psychiatrist. Not that I think you need one, but first of all, there's nothing wrong with you. The difficulty in identifying our own shame is a function of the emotion itself. It's a self-protective mechanism. Shame is a state in which we view ourselves at times in the harshest possible light, and that is a self-view that is really uncomfortable and disorienting, especially if we've developed a self-concept in a certain way, and to have that immediately sometimes undermined or broken into a million pieces. It's often easier to just quietly pick the pieces up and move on. without processing them.
With regard to that, I'd like to share with you 3 experiences I had during my career and just a week ago. Of course, I also experienced serious complications in patients. Two came to my mind. One of a patient who nearly turned blind after I accidentally prescribed this patient a too high dose of ethambutol. And another patient who I diagnosed with Wegener's granulomatosis, a nodule in the thorax, which eventually appeared to be lung cancer. So thereby missing a possible curative operation for this patient. And I remembered I felt very guilty. And I immediately tried to resolve things for this patient as good as possible, as well as possible. And another event was a week ago when I missed an appointment, a meeting appointment with a PhD candidate. In the back of my head, I thought it was Thursday, but the appointment really was on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I had a very busy clinic, and well, I just missed it. And I realized that in the evening, and I felt very embarrassed and shamed. These other 2 life-threatening events caused me guilt feelings, and the other, not so life-threatening, made me feel very ashamed. How should I see this in this Tracy and Robbins model?
Well, highly esteemed professor, first, thank you for sharing that. It's really powerful to get to hear your stories for all of us, and this is more of what we need to do in our culture. It's hard to know exactly what goes on in your self-evaluation, in your mind, and your heart. I might suggest maybe that there's something about how you see yourself that might be, at this point in your career, more deeply connected to being a mentor than to being a physician. It could be that you have been through so many difficulties as a physician, so many, patient deaths, bad outcomes, even errors, that you have found a way to be resilient in those situations such that you have a capacity for shame resilience that has developed over time, but maybe having not had the trigger of letting down a mentee to have developed that same degree of resilience. Those are 2 theories I have. The third is that we don't know. It's hard to know. Shame is remarkably complex. And for us to be able to say in any given person why an emotion experienced is certainly outside of our ability as researchers or people.
Thank you. Maybe we can discuss this a little bit further.
I would love to. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Afterwards. Do I have room for another question?
If it's a very short question and a very, very short answer.
Okay.
Then it's about the maladaptive reaction on shame. Well, it impairs learning, it diminishes empathy, you state, and these are reactions that we don't like to see in our learners. And I wondered, should we screen our resonance on this?
Very short answer, please.
Yeah, thank you, highly esteemed professor. It's a question I've been asked many times. The very short answer is no, we should not. We should be aware and anticipate the shame that will likely occur as a part of their training process, but to label someone as shame-prone or shame-resilient without knowing them or understanding their story would certainly be premature and would probably orient us towards bias. So I would say we should not do that. Use awareness instead.
I agree with that, and thank you for your answers. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Smink, for your position. The following opponent is also a member of the assessment committee, and that's Professor Driessen, whose chair is medical education at the University of Maastricht, and today he has also accepted the role of secretary of this committee, for which I'm very grateful.
Dear candidate, dear Captain Bynum, this is the first time that I can address an Air Force captain. I feel very honored. Wow, this is really a fascinating piece of scholarly work. I love to read it. I was fascinated by it. And when I came to, of course, I had in the back of my mind that I had to discuss with you now at this moment. So when I came to chapter 7, I was struck by one of your major conclusions. You analyzed the wellness crisis, and one of your second reason for this crisis is that we lack a diversity of research methods to study it. Then I thought, let's go back. How is it with Dr. Bynum? And I looked, just a single research method. And if I read the discussions, you fell in love with hermeneutic phenomenology. So falling in love is beautiful, but what is the limitation of studying shame from a single lens?
Yeah, thank you, highly esteemed professor, for your question. We as a community, I don't think we lack diverse methods. I think we have not utilized them to their full capacity, especially in studying well-being. This research program is the start. It is hopefully the start of a career in research and education that utilizes diverse methods to answer different types of questions than what we've asked with this research program. The reason we use hermeneutics across the studies was purely because of the research question itself and the fact that we could not or did not feel like we could presuppose that the way residents experience shame is the same as students, is the same as pre-medical students. Their environments are different, their contexts are different. And so while we did discuss, especially in the final study, departing from hermeneutics, I kept coming back to the need to understand more deeply the nature and the meaning of that phenomenon. Now, what happened, interestingly, is that as we navigated the analysis of the final study, we found that many of the structures we had identified in the parts of shame before were presenting themselves again. And this allowed us to go further into the deeper meanings, into the essences of shame, whereas in the beginning studies, we were focused so much more on the parts. So even within a hermeneutic analysis through and through, we were able to change in an iterative way the way we looked at shame and the depths to which we reach with that phenomenon.
Okay, but so if I understand you correctly, so you used it because of the research question, that made sense. And the way you were studying your topic, shame, changed over time. And I can see that back in the different steps. That's one of the fascinating things. That's why I love to read the whole thesis and not a single paper, because you see the changes and the effect of time. But then, these are your own words, you write about hermeneutic phenomenology. The product of hermeneutic phenomenology is deeper understanding of the phenomenon rather than theory development. But then, on page 102, a novel theory, not just a normal theory, but a novel theory of self-concept formation. Congratulations, the theory of Bynum. But then I wondered, weren't you using a microscope, and you discovered and you made progress, but maybe if you had used an fMRI or another research method, it would have been easier to get to the same point or even further. Could you reflect on that? For example, what if you had used grounded theory?
Yeah, thank you for your question, highly esteemed professor. Well, for one, I do present a theory at the end of the discussion. That theory was not imagined in the beginning, the middle, or even the end of this program of research. That theory emerged, and unexpectedly. And so how we describe how that emerged, to me as a constructivist, is less important than the fact that it did, that was a product of a co-construction across a program of research. Had we used another methodology, I am certain we would have probably come up with very meaningful findings about shame. Somewhat by virtue of the methodology, somewhat by virtue of our team and our incredible participants and their willingness to share. It is important, though, that this is the methodology we have used. This is the foundation we have laid. And what's more important than maybe considering what other methodologies would have yielded, it's important to recognize the limitations of the methodology we did use, and to think about how we continue filling those gaps with different methodologies and different epistemological orientations in the future.
Okay. And yeah, I think this is our important reflections you make, and I think you did a beautiful job with this research methods. Then I have a personal question. In the table with on chart 1 with shame triggers, one of the shame triggers is rejections from scholarly journals. I'm an editor and I've sent out thousands of rejections, so help me. What should I do differently tomorrow to make the shame trigger less?
Yeah, so thank you, highly esteemed professor, for that question. Nothing. I don't think that's necessarily your responsibility. I think the fact that you're aware of that could be happening is important. But engagement with shame sometimes is a two-part engagement. Sometimes it's just within the individual. What I would hope is that the person receiving that rejection has a support network around them, that they have the ability to see that failure not as a marker of a flawed self, but as an opportunity to improve the paper, improve the writing, and then submit again to another journal. As shame-prone individuals, I'll just speak for myself, I did not lack that ability until I discovered this construct and had done this research. I think it's incumbent on us as mentors and supporters and friends to help someone navigate that rejection. You as the journal editor, I don't think you bear responsibility for how that person self-evaluates in response. Okay. Now, just don't make it worse.
No. So I take care of my language. Yes.
Right, yes.
Yes, and take care of my co-researchers. Right. Okay,
Agreed.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you, Professor Driesen, for your opposition. The following opponent is Dr. Waterval, and he's assistant professor of the School of Health Professions and Education in the University of Maastricht.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear esteemed candidate, of course I should start with congratulating you and your supervisors with this impressive achievement. However, I would like to jump directly to my first question. A question that I've learned within the first 10 minutes when reading your dissertation. A question that I will integrate from now on in my daily life, in my daily practice. How are you currently feeling about yourself?
Oh.
Okay, this is by far an inappropriate question, and this is an unsafe environment. So I would like to rescue you, not that you need rescue. But nevertheless, the question illustrates why I think your work is a showcase example of the vision of our school. We try to integrate theory into practice. And in my view, I see many possibilities in which I could use the theoretical insights of your work in my daily practice. And I would like to continue on that domain. As a practitioner, I work as a student advisor. We regularly speak with students who are facing impaired wellness, to use your terminology, and that directly or indirectly have an impact on their study career and the choices they make. We speak bachelor and master students in medicine, and the profiles you described in your chapters, they resonate with the students that we meet. But believe it or not, only over the last weeks, we've spoken to 3 bachelor students, 2 master students, explicitly about their feelings of shame, and they were not mentioned in your book. Do you have an idea which type of shame we could have been talking about?
A highly esteemed professor, I do not. No.
No idea? I give you, in chapter 5, you're talking about, 5 about students who enter the medical program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're talking about, you met with students seeking admission, a highly esteemed professor, to the...
No, not to enter, but to...
Apply?
Exit.
Exit.
Students who exit the medical program, who are thinking about exiting the medical program, they feel ashamed. Mm-hmm. They feel ashamed because they were chosen.
Yeah.
Does it resonate with you? Can you imagine that these feelings exist among these students and how to approach them?
Yeah, I mean, highly esteemed professor, absolutely. I think in some ways the decision to leave training or leave the profession, and worse, being forced to leave the profession for some reason, may entail the one of the greatest failures of self-actualization that a future physician can experience. The becoming a physician is I would argue at the highest degree of self-actualization that many humans can experience, especially people that have capacity well beyond my colleague and I here, surgeons, for example. To have to leave the profession and not have the chance to reach that self-actualized state may present a massive threat to someone's self-concept and would very likely incur feelings of shame.
Or they feel outside because they are the only ones who are doubting.
Yeah.
How can you doubt about becoming a doctor? You've made it through the pre-entry exam. You're the chosen one. That feeling of being an outstander. It's not a critique, it's actually an invitation. Because I like your work very much. I would like to do a research with you if you're interested, particularly on these type of students.
Well, I appreciate the invitation very much, and it would be a fascinating group to study.
How would such a research look like?
How would that look? So, well, I would again qualitatively is how I would approach this.
Okay.
With the idea of gaining a deeper understanding of those experiences, engaging in close, probably one-on-one interviews.
Okay.
Focus groups would not be safe, likely.
So no hermeneutic phenology?
The good Dr. Dreesen has me a little nervous about continuing down the hermeneutic route.
Because could we set up a research? Would we look at shame, how it manifests across the oceans?
Oh yes, absolutely. Last week I had the privilege of giving a course to a very international group of family medicine physicians from many different cultures and countries, and their experiences of shame that they shared were influenced by factors I could never have predicted that existed within their cultures, within their histories, within their socio-political organizations. We have presented in this thesis a westernized view of shame in medical education. That's very important. Our goal and our charge is to create cross-cultural understandings and representations, and that is a critical next step.
We'll meet afterwards.
That sounds good. Thank you.
No, let me move on to my second question. Before, I would like to, especially, reading your work for me was really a joyful experience. It evoked strong feeling of recognition, especially chapter 7. The observation that impaired wellness perhaps is not always a disease that has to be cured, but can be viewed as an opportunity to grow and develop. I really agree with you on that. I think that should be the heart of the core of our mission of people involved with student guidance and mentoring. So help me on this one. Tomorrow morning, I'm hosting a group session, and there are medical students who have problems with perfectionism behavior. Fear of judgment and skewed frame of referencing is, as you noted, sometimes the root of this. And promoting a growth mindset is one of the aims of this session, and luckily you are also giving that as a practical implementation. So I'm happy that I hear that. But I want to talk, and maybe your Paraninf could help me on this one. I have a question on page 93, and could you read out the first 2 sentences?
Establishing growth mindsets and reframing learning as rehearsal, not performance, are 2 strategies to reduce the risk of shame in the midst of expected academic struggle. Research indicates that individuals' mindsets about their inherent capabilities can be changed, at least temporarily.
Okay. Help me out, at least temporarily. How temporal are these changes, and what do I need to do tomorrow to make them more structural?
This again comes back to the self-conscious level. First, gaining an understanding of how they are actively self-evaluating. Where is if you're working with someone who's struggling, on what are they placing the blame? One way to change a mindset in a moment is to take that blame and transfer it off of the person onto something that can be fixed, or something that has the capacity to be changed. My incompetence, my unworthiness is difficult to change in a moment, if ever. My needing to practice vaginal deliveries, my need to speak up and say that I'm unprepared to do this procedure, the fact that I haven't slept in 24 hours. These are things that I can change and fix that could be equally as blameworthy as my own incompetence for the reason that my error occurred. So helping me transition the locus of blame to something that I have the capacity to fix can take me out of a shame state and into a more of a guilt state. Then you have to orient me towards a roadmap and ideally walk with me down that road towards opportunities to make that situation right and to grow and improve. What we found qualitatively is that there is some suggestion that the ability to utilize guilt for constructive growth may be aided by a growth mindset, whereas shame seems to incur a more fixed mindset or maybe fueled by that fixed mindset.
Mm-hmm. Can I continue? No.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waterval, for your position. The following opponent is Dr. Beuken, who's also an assistant professor of the School of Health Profession Education in Maastricht.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I too would like to start by congratulating you and your supervisors with this impressive thesis. I'm especially inspired by the personal reflections throughout your thesis, and it is certainly a good example for anyone who wants to embrace researchers' personal connections to their research topic. Today is the first time we ever meet, but due to the openness you show in your work, it feels like I already know you a little bit, which also makes it a little bit easier to ask you some challenging questions today. And I want to start with a question that stuck with me throughout reading your thesis. You consistently refer to shame as something negative, with almost always negative outcomes. And although you explained your understanding of shame well, I must say I do not entirely agree. I could, for example, refer to conceptualization of shame by Norbert Elias as something that civilizes individuals. In this theory, shame is an imposed or internalized feeling that comes with not fulfilling a societal norm, and shame thereby ensures that people behave according to standards of society. Now, assuming that these standards are in line with the standards of good healthcare, shame may be a tool to civilize healthcare professionals. So, would you agree with me that shame could have a neutral or maybe even a positive connotation as well? And maybe controversially, some healthcare professionals might benefit from a little bit of shame.
Yeah. Thank you, esteemed Professor, for a critically important question. I wholeheartedly agree. And it's really not I don't agree because it's my opinion. I agree because we are all sitting here as evolved humans who have brought with us through this journey through evolution the capacity to feel shame. There is a reason it still exists, and it serves critical functions, particularly in keeping us aligned with social norms, with societal expectations. Oftentimes our shame, or the avoidance of our shame, is one of the most powerful motivators keeping us a part of the herd. It also can be a very powerful signal that tells us when we've gone outside the herd and need to make reparative behavior to come back. So I wholeheartedly agree that shame is an important tool. And problematically, shame can be used as a weapon. And it can be used to drive assimilation to those standards and norms. It can be used to pull people into ideologies or into beliefs that are at odds with their values or behaviors, or with the values or behaviors of the profession in which it's occurring. We see in medical education shame being used as an important tool. As a residency program director, if you've done something that takes you way outside of the bounds of professionalism and you express no capacity for shame, we have a much bigger problem than the behavior itself. But the degree to which we use shame as a tool and not weaponize it is critical to our ability to manage this emotion's destructive potential. One of the ways we do that is, even if someone deserves to feel shame or should, staying in that shame state is not necessarily a healthy place to remain, nor one that will orient them back towards the herd and that reparative action.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd agree with you, and I think that's also quite an essential part of this theory, is that role models of how we deal with shame are very important. And I didn't actually see the term role model in your thesis, but I'm wondering what it means to you and how you are a role model for shame.
Gosh, thank you, esteemed professor. This is a great question. I think the role modeling is the most important facet of role modeling when it comes to shame is the willingness to share your experiences of it. It's the willingness to humble yourself, to humanize yourself. The role modeling, really, where you'll find the most role modeling probably is my own reflections that I include in there about my own experiences. Anytime I give a talk on shame, I always start with my own story. That's role modeling. It makes it okay. It sets an environment in which this is an acceptable emotion, albeit a really challenging one. We do need more information about how role models might be used to facilitate shame resilience.
You may finish your answer. You may also say enough is enough.
This is fun, but I will say enough is enough, and thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Burkert, for your position, and Mr. Bynum. The time appointed for the defense of your thesis has now passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the way you have defended it. And I request that you and your company here and online await the results of our deliberation and our return in this room. And with that, I suspend the meeting.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. fly by now, don't waste all your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile.
I reopen this academic session. And Mr. Bynum, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the way you have defended it. And in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And Professor Teunissen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
I'll start with a question. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Highly esteemed professor, I promise.
Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I confer upon you, Will Bynum, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Congratulations.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Lara.
Now I hand over to Lara to say some additional words to you, Will.
Well, today's an important day. After years of hard work and dedication, you have achieved your goal. I'm sorry, there's feedback. I'm just going to try to get through this and ignore the feedback. You've achieved your goal of earning a PhD, but you have done more than that, though. You have started a conversation in the field of medical education about the experiences of shame that our learners face. You've also brought that conversation beyond the walls of medical schools and academic teaching hospitals. You brought it into the profession. I wonder if at this early stage in your career, Will, you realize how significant an achievement that really is. There are thousands of scholars working in the field of medical education, and while we're all from different backgrounds, we all share one thing. We all want to make a difference. We want to leave a mark on the field with the work that we do. Not all of the scholars will be able to do that. Sure, we'll publish and we'll give talks, but to leave the field foundationally and significantly changed because of the work we did, that's a goal few will achieve. Will, you did achieve that, and you did it with your thesis research. You forced our field to look at an ugly truth. You shame our learners and ourselves. And more than that, you demanded that we do something about it. You published in our field's top journals and in medicine's top journals. You've done podcasts and blogs, you made websites and videoed interviews and worked with artists to make your knowledge visibly aware and available. You took all the affordances of our modern age, from social media to multimedia, to demand that our field recognize the harm that shame inflicts on our learners and on ourselves. You accomplished that by delving into the stories of the participants in your work. You took on the daunting challenge of truly embracing that constructivist belief that we co-create knowledge with our participants. You could have surveyed people, you could have distilled it down to issues of means and standard deviations, but you didn't. Instead, you met your participants as people who survived a very painful personal experience, and you asked them to share their stories, their shame. And you cared, and you deeply listened. You didn't shy away from the very personal engagement it takes to do hermeneutic phenomenology. Many researchers can't do that. Many researchers can't even pronounce hermeneutic phenomenology. What I'm trying to make sure you hear today, Will, from both Pim and myself, is that you've done something really special with this research. It has been an honor to work with you during this journey. As PhD supervisors, you can imagine that Pim and I meet all kinds of different aspiring scholars. But Will, you're a very special and rare person. I think you learned from Pim and I, yes, but you grew through the degree. and you quickly became a collaborator more than a learner. I learned from you during this work, Will, and for that, I am truly grateful. Thank you for letting us be part of this journey with you. It's been a pleasure and an honor and a joy. I can't wait to see what you do next, Will. Congratulations.
Professor Fabio, for this laudation. Dear Dr. Bynum, also on behalf of the Maastricht University and the Deans, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired, and I wish you a great career, and I hope you have the opportunity to celebrate this special day. I also congratulate your family and friends, of course, and guests here in the room and those online. I also congratulate Professor Teunissen and Professor Fabio with this new doctor, and I would like to thank the members of the opposition, of the assessment committee for their preparations and their work, and I would like to thank the Padel and Joshua Faferiu and Luke Peters for the technical support which made this hybrid academic session possible. Having said that, I'm almost closing this session. I have a few announcements. I would like the audience to leave the room in a minute, except for the photographer. And then we're going to make a picture here with Professor Fabio and Dr. Delacroix. And then we will go to the stairs, at the bottom of the stairs, at the foot of the stairs, we're going to make another picture. And then we go to the rafter. You can already go to the rafter. And then if you want to know when you can congratulate the young doctor, that's easy. We go first and then you follow. Having said that, I close this meeting.
Congratulations. Thank you. Thanks.
Well done.
I appreciate it. Well done. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Congratulations to the Paralympics.
Wonderfully,
flawless.